Modern times confirm the shift in culture that has overtaken humanity since the Reformation in the 16th century. In Reformation times, a life and death struggle was carried on with the ultimate certainties of the Church at stake. That struggle stood at the center of the common cultural consciousness in Europe. In the balance hung the question of right standing before God. Was a person justified by faith or by works? If Luther was the thundering prophet who reawakened the Church to the truth of the gospel, Calvin was the architect, a wise master builder, whose eye took in the whole of church and society. In the end, Luther would startle Rome, but as Catholic historian Hilaire Belloc says, Calvin became the great instrument of change, since he set out with greatest lucidity and unparalleled energy to form a counter-church. He it was who made the new religion wholly hostile to the old one. But the Reformation became a victim of the rising tide of secularism. The question about personal justification before God no longer interests mankind. In the face of the harrowing realities of the last 2 centuries, much of humanity has placed God and the gospel in the dock, decided they were inadequate and irrelevant, and dismissed them. The American church only gradually felt the weight of the great cultural shift that had overtaken Europe. As the 20th century began, mainline American denominations joined the world that now isolated Orthodoxy. The confession of the triune God of the Scriptures that had been in place for 16 centuries was now dislodged. Men like Kant, Hegel, Darwin, Marx, Freud, Dewey, Einstein played important roles in making over the world. Rapid change pulled the church apart. Conservatives poked fun at the emerging modern church and predicted the collapse of Protestant culture. Liberals drew upon the legacy of 19th century historian Philip Schaff and others. They relied on the provocative and suspect leadership of men like Walter Rauschenbusch, Shaler Matthews, Harry Emerson Fosdick, and the Presbyterian Henry Sloane Coffin. Henry Van Dyke's popular hymn, "Joyful, Joyful We Adore Thee," set to the familiar music from the final movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, blended 19th century humanism and 20th century religious liberalism. This blend was especially noticeable in a line from the 3rd verse, "Thou our Father, Christ our brother, all who live in love are thine." Religious liberalism promoted the anti-doctrinal, experience-oriented, secular mood of the emerging culture. The modernist movement successfully revised confessional standards and declared its independence from former doctrinal norms. Within the Presbyterian Church, USA, additional chapters were added to the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1903. 20 years later, many Presbyterian ministers signed the Auburn Affirmation.
The Auburn Affirmation was a 1,500-word document issued the day after Christmas in 1923 and signed by 150 ministers primarily in the New York area. It is usually regarded as the embodiment of liberal Protestantism. Now, liberal Protestantism can be defined in a variety of ways. The best definition, I think, of liberal Protestantism is the conscious adaptation of Christian teaching to modern culture. Now, the way that conservative Presbyterians in the Northern Presbyterian Church, the way they opposed liberalism was to assert 5 essential doctrines. Those doctrines were the inerrancy of Scripture, the vicarious atonement, the resurrection of Christ, the virgin birth, and belief in miracles. All of these underscore the supernatural character and miraculous character of Christianity. What the affirmation did was to say, on the one hand, that these 5 points were unconstitutional, that the whole tactic of asserting these 5 points was contrary to the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church, contrary to Presbyterian procedure and order. And it also went on to say that these 5 doctrines were subject to a variety of interpretations. What the Auburn Affirmation did then was to pave the way for any interpretation to come into the church, and also made it very difficult for conservatives to argue on one single meaning of the Bible, a particular text in Scripture, or of the confession of faith.